Good morning and welcome back to the NWR Virtual Healthcare Conference. My name's Matt Wright and we're looking forward to bringing you another group of very interesting presentations today. First up for the morning we have Neurotech, which is listed under the ASX ticker NTI, and joining us is the Executive Director, Dr. Tom Duthie. Before we get started, just another reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in using the Q&A panel within Zoom. I'll pass it over to you now, Tom. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks to NWR for hosting the event today and of course yesterday. I'll just start with our standard disclaimer. I'll walk you through some of our strategies and our clinical focus here at Neurotech. We'll also touch on some of our interesting clinical results, pipeline, financials, and outlook. I think this time I will start with the cap structure. I made a late change here this morning. Current market cap's around 50 million. We have about 8 million in the bank. We completed a $9 million capital raise in Q4 of last calendar year, which will fully fund our core clinical programs through to efficacy readouts, which I'll walk you through this morning. We have around 1,700 shareholders. We have some listed options and some unlisted options, but we do spend the majority of our cash, as you'd expect from a small biotech, on our R&D. Our overarching corporate burn is less than $1 million a year, so we're not heavy on internal infrastructure. We do run the company quite virtually, and we push those roles and responsibilities out to service providers. So we basically focus on predominantly focus on pediatric neurological disorders. We have an exclusive worldwide license to NTI 164, which is a broad spectrum cannabinoid drug product. We have patents lodged at the PCT stage. They will move into the national phase over the next sort of 6 to 12 months. We have done a lot of work on our NTI 164 cannabinoid extract, but preclinically with a number of different neuronal and microglial cell models. So we had some confidence that there was at least a benefit in vitro. And of course, it was incumbent on us to move that into the clinic as quickly as possible through very rigorous and diligent manufacturing process and really regulating ourselves at day one as a drug product, as opposed to a very basic over-the-counter type cannabinoid program. And we have now completed the world's first Autism Spectrum Disorder phase 1/2 trial. And I'll walk you through some of those data points shortly. We also have a legacy device called the Mente device, which is actually for autism as well. We don't spend a lot of time and money on that, but it has, say, for example, it has TGA approval. Here are our 4 core strategies in more detail. We focus on pediatric patients. We focus on rare neurological disorders where the literature supports something called neuroinflammation. So these are brain processes that lead to high inflammation, and that confers a clinical effect in these patients. We also focus really strongly on partnering with key opinion leaders and clinicians, at least within the Australian context so far, because they're really our gatekeeper to patient recruitment, patient support, and also they help drive our clinical data clearly. And we are regulating ourselves as a drug product. We are not, to repeat, we are not interested in an over-the-counter product which has no medical claims and no pricing power and no reimbursement available. These are the strategies in more detail. So we do focus on pediatric because it is often overlooked by big pharma. I think advantageously, they do also tend to be unencumbered drug therapy markets, which lack standards of care and approved treatments. There's also a lack of clinical trials. So we're not competing against 10 or 12 different global pharmaceutical companies with much deeper pockets than ours to try to get patients recruited into these trials. And also by focusing on rarer pediatric indications, we also can leverage those regulatory levers from both the Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency. Orphan drug designation is but one of those type of levers. And we really focus in on neurological disorders with that neuroinflammatory process. So the literature supports that. Our preclinical work supports that. And we've now shown efficacy that our product does what it says it can do in a human patient, as opposed to a preclinical model, and that's in autism. So these will be chronic disorders typically, and so there will be a lifelong commitment to our drug product, which is an oral once-a-day formulation. I think we've talked about the partnering opportunities with leaders in the field, and I've also touched on the drug product development, which is important for both pricing and reimbursement for on-label prescribing. I think we've made really rapid progress here over the last 2 years. So turning your eye to the left-hand side, in 2020, we had a set of interesting data on NTI 164. We converted that to some manufacturing scale up, and we established our analytical methods for the product. We filed those patent applications, which are moving through the PCT process. And then in 22, we had our beachhead ASD phase 1/2 trial, which I'll talk about. But that's really now led to a whole raft of other applications of NTI 164 across these rare, in most cases, rare pediatric neurological disorders. So in 2023, we're a very different company than 2020. So we will have a phase 2 trial in Rett syndrome, a phase 1/2 trial in something called Pandanus, which I'll come to, a phase 1/2 trial in cerebral palsy, and also a later phase 2/3 trial in autism spectrum disorder, which is a randomised double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Again, summarising that pipeline, again, we have both depth and breadth in our pipeline relative to what we had back in 2020 to 2021 on the left-hand side. So very rapid development. Here's the summary of the strategic elements that I've presented here thus far. So our group strategy on the left implements into that clinical strategy with Pandanus, cerebral palsy, ASD. We announced on the 20th of March a new phase 2 program in Rett syndrome. That was very much clinician driven, and I'll come to the reasons why shortly. But those trial focuses are really lending themselves to some of these regulatory levers that I mentioned. So we quite like that approach for us. And to give context as to why we like that approach, I've provided 2 commercialization examples here of 2 companies that have done much the same kind of process in focusing almost exclusively in pediatric patients, and have developed, some very strong valuation points, and have also transacted on the basis that they have been focused in pediatrics. So GW Pharmaceuticals, that has a product called Epidiolex. That's a cannabis-derived CBD formulation that is now FDA and EMA approved for 2 very rare epileptic disorders called Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut. There is a third, tuberous sclerosis, they also have approval for now. But just really focusing on the core there, these are orphan disorders. And in 2022, Epidiolex delivered $736 million in revenue to Jazz Pharmaceuticals, who, seeing the potential of GW, acquired that business for $7.2 billion in 2021. Within the Australian context, we now have a very elegant example in Neuron Pharmaceuticals. This is the company I've followed for many years. I used to be an analyst on the stock in the early 2000s. And the company has turned it around from the early days where they had limited success in some adult-based indications, and they focused their attention into rare pediatric neurodevelopmental disorders. And they were able to execute a partnership with Arcadia. And very recently, last week or 2, they announced the FDA clearance for their product, Dabu, trofinetide in Rett syndrome, which is a big event for both themselves and Arcadia, but also I think more broadly for us, it validates and highlights the opportunity that exists by focusing in on these rarer disease disorders. Here's our clinical focus in summary. I've mentioned the indications. I've mentioned why we target these indications. We're basically looking for indications where there is a strong neuroinflammatory effect that's well published and well known in the literature, lacks effective treatments, pediatric onset, and rare and orphan if possible. Before I touch on some of the indications in more details, I would like to just remind everyone today that we are focused on autism as our lead indication, if you like. Now, autism is a major problem here in Australia. We now have 1 in 50 children, or 1 in 50 people, I should say, with autism in Australia, and that's a 40-fold increase over the last 20 years. But what's transpiring here is that ASD patients now represent a disproportionate share of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, with slightly over 1/3 of patients on the scheme are autistic. So the cost to the taxpayer of funding those patients is now at 6 billion, but the NDIS itself is expected to grow very significantly by 2033. So the implied annual cost of these patients, this is NDIS data, is about $32,000 or $33,000 per annum in costs, direct costs as they relate to physio, psychology, speech therapy, and so on. So we think there's actually a strong market need for therapies that can intervene to improve these patients' lives, to remove that occupational therapy type component that currently exists and allow these children to go back to school and their caregivers to be able to free themselves to also be more productive citizens. I wanted to just touch on Pandas PANS. So this is a mouthful to say, so I'll stick to the acronyms, but these are two disorders that are, in one case, of unknown etiologies. We don't know what causes PANS, but we do have evidence that a streptococcus infection causes Pandas. But these are, this is a disorder which is very rapidly, is very rapid onset, I should say. The manifestations of this disorder is quite straightforward, albeit it's very complex in its derivation, and that being these children go to sleep normal and they wake up with uncontrolled tic movements, severe OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and also anxiety, depression. It is a recognized problem now from 2015 to 2022. There's been a raft of new documents through diagnostic criteria, treatment guidelines, and also it's been classified in 2022 by the WHO as a bona fide disorder or disease. It is rare, and there is evidence of neuroinflammation. And I think why we also like it is that there's no FDA or EMA approved treatments. Intravenous immunoglobulin is used off-label. That's about $30,000 a year in the United States. It's certainly not proven, and it's certainly high cost. So our phase 1/2 study in 15 kids is expected to complete recruitment this half and expected to report data early in the second half of this calendar year. Again, this has been a clinician-led trial for us. Cerebral palsy, again, I'll just touch on some of the reasons here as to why we're interested in cerebral palsy. For much the same reason as Pandas PANS, that there are treatments that are approved, but there are issues and problems with some of these treatments. We're seeking to target NTI 164 into spastic cerebral palsy, which is about 80% of cases. Again, for this very much the same reasons, there's now published literature by Professor Fay, in fact, who ran our autism studies of the role or the pathogenic role of inflammation and its ongoing role in the comorbidity of cerebral palsy. So that gives us some confidence that when we commence a study in these predominant predominant pediatric population, that we have a good scientific basis for using our product in these children. It is a significant market. It's around $4.3 billion annually. Rett syndrome, very topical indication in the last couple of weeks. So this is a rare neurological and developmental disorder, exclusively the result of mutations in the MECP2 gene on the X chromosome. So it's often fatal for boys and it's debilitating in girls. So the patient target population is almost exclusively girls. But for Rett syndrome, we've now recently had the first ever approval through Neuron and Arcadia. And I think that really nicely sets the benchmark for what the FDA will accept as both important clinical endpoints and also their threshold of safety tolerance. So we can now, we spent a lot of time, in fact, looking at these phase 3 trials in Rett syndrome by Neuron and others. And we've now developed a phase 2 program. We expect to file that for ethics approval in Australia this month. And we expect to start recruiting patients certainly in the second half of this calendar year. Rett syndrome does have a neuroinflammatory effect in these patients, and that's quite well published and quite well accepted. And as sort of the recent approval of Daybue trofinetide states, this is a reasonably significant market opportunity with very high drug product pricing, and the incidence is actually rare. So from a number of patient perspective, it's very low. But from a market opportunity, it's very high because of the high willingness to pay for these patients. We'll turn now to our data from Autism Spectrum Disorder study. We initially, this was a 28-day study, but the patients and the doctors wanted all children to remain on trial. So we were able to generate a very significant amount of data over 52, well, they're now crossed over 52 weeks. We've got a 6-month extension, in fact, but the primary data readouts that we've delivered to the market were at 28 days, 20 weeks, and 52 weeks. This was an open label single arm study, initially with 14 patients. We've had 11 patients cross 52 weeks of treatment. And we were just looking at safety. We weren't really powered, as you can imagine, with a sample size so small to look at any efficacy measures. We'd recorded no serious adverse events over the entire 52-week period. Interestingly, only one patient was on a drug called risperidone, which is a standard in autism, but it's not universally well liked given its side effect profile. The most important adverse events were really just some mild nausea and some abdominal pain. That could be related to the oil formulation, and we'll know more about that in our phase 2/3 trial. But basically, from a pathology perspective, these kids were all perfectly normal and fine. I won't bore you with the table here, except to say that we weren't powered for any kind of efficacy endpoints, but we did show across a number of gold standard batteries significant efficacy results in the most important clinical measures, being severity of illness, adaptive behavior, and social responsiveness. And these improvements were very consistent over the 52 weeks. I just wanted to touch on one of the more important measures and one that's easy to illustrate for investors, I think, and that's the severity of illness scale. So on the left-hand side, you can see at baseline, these children were categorized as somewhere between moderate to markedly ill. So these are level 2, level 3 autistic patients, basically those that require substantial or very substantial support. And you can see after 52 weeks of treatment, we were able to shift that scale down by over 1 scale point to the children sitting at the junction of borderline ill to mildly ill. Now that is transformational for not only the child, but also the caregiver. And Professor Fay, who ran the study, has been quoted numerous times on the clinical meaningfulness of this data, and it is clinically meaningful. But you can see here at 52 weeks that we've seen a stabilization of their symptoms. We haven't improved it really any further from 32 weeks, but it's also important to note that these patients haven't reverted either. So their symptom scores have not got any worse. They've remained stable over the long term. We reached some really nice conclusions here. I think one of the primary outcomes that we did show is that our product is actually an enabling product. It doesn't restrict these children's behaviors like a Ritalin or risperidone does, which seeks to reduce the aggravation and the irritability. This does that, but it also enables these children to become more communicative, got it out, more socially aware, and also can integrate into society. So that's super important for both the patient and, of course, their parents. Just turning now to our 12-month milestones. We've delivered 5 important milestones so far this calendar year. We have 3 more important milestones this half. So we expect to receive our HREC clearance to start a 15-patient phase 2 Rett syndrome trial. Again, this is looking at both efficacy and some degree of safety, but we've classified it as a phase 2 principally because we now have a lot of safety information on NTI 164. We expect to start that cerebral palsy approval process this half and garner an HREC approval there. We expect to complete PANS recruitment. So again, 15 kids, that's recruited extremely rapidly because there's no standards, there's no competing trials, there's a committed clinician. And then in the second half, we have a whole raft of both clinical results anticipated and also commencing and finalizing both patient recruitment across, for example, in autism. We expect to complete recruitment and we expect to start recruitment in Rett syndrome. We have, again, a number of patients with Rett syndrome on the register of our initiated trial sites, of which there's 2 in Victoria. So we're very much looking forward to executing that trial as well. Our outlook, we are focused on rare pediatric neurological disorders. I hope I've conveyed to you today that we've now got long-term safety and efficacy in NTI 164 in a very important neuroinflammatory disorder, autism. And we've accelerated our clinical development via these rapid and cost-effective proof of concept phase 1/2 trials in Australia in these new neurological indications, Pandas, PANS, cerebral palsy and Rett. I fervently believe we have strong clinician engagement, which I think is a really nice barrier to entry for others seeking to do much the same work as we're undertaking here in Australia. And we have potential access to a number of these regulatory levers in with the FDA and the European Medicines Agency, as I've mentioned. And importantly, I think in this very difficult fiscal environment, we are fully funded to complete all of these clinical trials and to develop a pathway for ourselves in the United States. And if you sort of bundle those goals and strategies together, we see that there's very significant valuation upside if we meet or exceed these goals. So that's the end of my talk today. I'd certainly like to hand back to Matt if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'll jump into a few questions as you've alluded to. So the first one, I think you might have touched on the cash position. I know the company completed a pretty significant raising not too long ago. Can you just give a bit more detail on that and the sort of support you received in that raise?
Sure. So that was a blend of institutional and high net worth 708 investors that participated in that book build. We raised the money through PAC Partners in Melbourne and Peloton in Sydney. There was certainly well in excess of $9 million in demand, but $9 million certainly felt to us as a board as the right number that balances the need to demonstrate that our strategies are executable and that we're backable as a team. I only joined the company around the time of the capital raise, so I don't have the sort of 2-3 year history. Maybe that's a good thing. But we certainly are being very diligent with the use of that capital. We've had some options that have been exercised as well, which have brought in around about $1 million over the last few months. So that's also been an important source of funds. But yeah, we now have a register that comprises more institutions than we had previously. And also our sort of core top 5-10 shareholders really hasn't changed much. So it's very tightly held in that regard. I think there's the clear nuance of the markets at the moment where, unfortunately, our placement price was set higher than our current price, and that's a fact. What our job is today is to deliver these clinical results. Hopefully they're positive. Hopefully we're re-rated, and hopefully everyone's happy.
Yeah, and you've touched on it there, Tom. But I mean, anything in the market related to medicinal cannabis has been, quite soft in recent times. Do you think, in the event that turns, that Neurotech would benefit from that?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm at pains to point out, and one thing you won't see me talk about a lot, is cannabis. So yes, we have a product that is derived from a cannabis plant. That is a fact. But I don't want that to distract from the core focus here, and that is we are not seeking to develop a cannabis oil that's sold over the counter or sold through a special access scheme or an authorized prescriber scheme. This is a strategy that we put in place to focus purely on regulating to the highest order with global regulators and making product claims. So I guess, yes, there has been some headwinds in the sector generally in cannabis, but we look at the market opportunity for over the counter, and it's just not attractive for us because there's no product differentiation, there's no pricing power, and there's no payment, there's no reimbursement typically. So we have the potential to price in a much more fulsome manner, reimburse at a higher at a rate that's acceptable to government and private payers, and we can make a medical claim, all of which are barriers to entry. And so yeah, I guess we sort of consider ourselves lucky to the extent that we have seen ourselves differentiated away from the challenges that exist in the context of Australian cannabis companies currently, and some of those regulatory changes like GMP requirements for cannabis derived products here in Australia. But that we don't get entrapped in that. We're not part of that. We're very different. We are obviously manufacturing our drug product in Australia, but our pathways are very regulated in terms of global healthcare groups like the FDA and the EMA.
Very good. And we've seen some of the sort of larger pharma players and distributors linked to the space. Despite what you've said there, have you had similar conversations at this point in time? Some of the names that come to mind are sort of GSKs and your Neurotechs. I know their names have popped up in the space.
Yeah, in short, no. A little bit early for us. So why we're doing these sort of phase 1-2 studies and developing, a thesis for not only investors, but the thesis for potential partners is, we can treat pediatric neuroinflammatory disorders, and we can treat them well, and we can treat them well without some of the noxious side effects that you would typically see through the use of, high dose steroids, whatever the case may be. And so for us, the value inflection points that exist for us are really there in the next 6 months as we sort of report out these clinical trials and generate that body of evidence. We also, have demonstrated, I think, very nicely that we have, continuity of manufacture. We have precision, manufacturing controls. We have product we can source. So, again, an important piece there is ultimately how we then deal with the FDA and the EMA. But it's certainly my goal as a small company and as a director of a small company to leverage the opportunity with much larger players over time. And so I just would, without any firm commitment clearly, and it's not guidance, but investors can look at our deck and see those commercialization examples that I've provided, because both have led to substantial returns for both shareholders, but also huge value upside.
Yeah, 100%. And just one quick final one. Obviously, Neuron's been a real talking point, and a good news story in the sector this week, and you've touched on Rett syndrome there. Where does the Neurotech program kind of fit in around that? Is it an adjunct treatment, or can you just talk to that quickly?
It's a good question. So we obviously have been watching Neuron pretty carefully, and I've watched it for many years, and it's self-evident to myself and the team that part of Neuron's strategy will be to register DAYBUE across those major pharma markets, which includes Australia. And so the reason we've moved now is because the 15 girls, and that's part of the trial, it'll randomise in a double-blinded manner to additional 34 girls, I think, later. But the reason we're doing that now is because DAYBUE is not approved, and therefore it's not approved. There's no standard treatment that a clinician is ethically bound to offer. And so we can recruit very easily without having to compare ourselves with or in combination with DAYBUE when it does land here in Australia. So it's about generating that initial evidence in a very cost and time effective manner.
Great. Thanks for that, Tom. That's a great presentation and very good answers there. So thanks for your time today. We'll leave it at that. And next up in a couple of minutes, we've got the next presentation, which is from one of the private companies, Curve Beam AI. So
thanks, Matt.
Everyone can join that. Thanks, Tom.